You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. The 13th century was one of the most transformational periods in Middle Eastern history. Towards the west of the Near East, Crusader armies and states formed. Towards the east, Mongol armies and states formed. But how did these two factors change the direction of Middle Eastern history? Helping us to understand this is Dr. Nicholas Morton. Dr. Nicholas Morton is a course leader from the history at Nottingham Trent University, the author or editor of several books. His most recent publication is The Mongol Storm, Making and Breaking Empires in the Medieval Near East. This work offers a multi-perspective account of the Mongol invasions into the Middle East during the 13th century. Nicholas also co-edits 3-book series with Routledge, including Global Histories Before Globalization. Nicholas, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much.
So I want to sort of start right at the beginning. We're going to have obviously a discussion about Crusaders. We're going to have a discussion about Mongols. I'm sure this is going to be a very, fun podcast for anyone interested in history. But I sort of want to start right at the beginning with you personally. What drew you to want to study this area, the Crusades, the Mongols, the Near East? What excited you? What interested you in this in the first place?
That's a great question. It's changed over time a little bit. So initially, it was just the sheer fact of the crusade that I found it's rather confusing, really, because, of course, when you think of Christianity, you think of Jesus's teaching to turn the other cheek and do good to those that hate you. And, of course, in the Bible, in the New Testament, where it says that someone came to arrest Jesus and one of Jesus's disciples chopped off the person who came to arrest Jesus's ear, and Jesus reattached the ear miraculously and said, those who live by the sword die by the sword, which is not entirely clear, but let's face it, it's not particularly positive about the use of violence. I just couldn't understand how you get from a place where you have Jesus saying these things on one hand and you have institutionalized holy war on the other. Where did that come from? And just understanding the origins of crusading when it seems so at variance to the Christian message, that was something that really drew me in because I wanted to understand it better and to really try and get my head around it. Over time, though, my interests have shifted a little bit because as I became more aware of Middle Eastern history in this era and all the various different cultures and communities across the region, not just in the region, but joining the region, whether from Southeast Asia or China or Africa or Western Christendom, just all these people in such a small area, all mixing and trading and fighting and exchanging ideas and making friends with each other and hating each other, and just all these interrelationships taking place in a small area. I find that fascinating. What did people think of each other? What did they learn from each other? What did they refuse to learn from each other? All those questions about interactions between cultures. For me now, that's much more of my motivation, really, because I do find that fascinating. If I could go back in time, it really would be to one of the big cities like Damascus or Aleppo or Acre or somewhere like that, and just to see what it's like with people from across Eurasia and Africa, all in this small area, and just what they made of each other, really, and how they related to each other.
I mean, give virtual reality headsets enough time and you'll be able to do that.
Well, there's a thought indeed, yeah.
So that sort of brings us kind of nicely to the Crusades themselves. I think that's probably the only time that's ever been said, nicely to the Crusades. So what were the Crusades? How did they come about?
Okay, so in terms of what they were, the Crusades began in 1095 with the launch of the First Crusade, which was a military expedition launched by the Pope, the idea being to conquer Jerusalem. This then led to a series of further crusades initially to consolidate control over Jerusalem during the course of the 12th century. And so you've got various crusades across the 12th century, the really big one being the Second Crusade. And then in 1187, Saladin reconquered Jerusalem from well, I'm not going to say Crusaders, it's by the time we talk about the Franks, so Western Europeans essentially living in the Middle East, which then triggered the Third Crusade, which was an attempt to reconquer Jerusalem from Saladin. It didn't reconquer Jerusalem from Saladin, but nonetheless, there was a great deal of fighting. And then these crusades continue into the 13th century until 1291, which is where the mainland presence of the Crusader states collapsed in the face of the advances of the Mamluk Empire, an Egyptian empire, which then destroyed what was left of the last Crusader state, which was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But while all of this is going on, there are lots of other crusades being launched elsewhere. So there are crusades launched in Iberia, so that's modern-day Spain and Portugal. There are crusades launched in the Baltic region against various pagan peoples in that area. There's crusades launched against heretics in southern France, and also occasionally against the papacy's political opponents, so crusades against Christians. There were even crusades against the Eskimos at one point. After that sort of medieval block of crusading in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, crusading becomes more defensive with the rise of the Ottoman Empire. So crusades are launched more to try and block the advance of the Ottoman Empire, although crusading continues on other frontiers as well. And crusading continues in many different forms right the way up to the early modern period. Historians have given different dates for the last formal crusade, which is normally when the moment at which the papacy stopped authorizing holy wars of this kind. Normally that's placed somewhere in the 17th or 18th century, but crusading went on for a long time. So sorry.
No, finish.
I was just saying, so crusading went on for a long time. It was waged on various different frontiers. But it's not just a medieval phenomenon.
Yes, it's interesting because it feels like, in a way, when I look at the history of the Crusades, and you talk about all these other Crusades that were happening across Europe, in a way, it feels like there's a kind of spring cleaning taking place all over. And it sort of, makes me wonder, because on the one hand, you could sort of say part of the reason you have all these Crusades happening within Europe, especially after the Crusades are launched in the Near East, is partially because perhaps a lot of rulers in Europe don't actually want to go to the Near East to fight, but they want, the legitimacy from the Vatican and the papacy. And so they say, well, we'll fight these wars in the Baltics or in the Balkans or wherever, where they also have territorial interests as well.
Yeah, it's a great observation. So just to pick up on 2 points you made there. One of the big, or arguably the biggest incentive, certainly biggest spiritual incentive for people taking part in crusading at this time, was the papacy's promise that those taking part in crusading would be given a general indulgence. And what that means is that, let's say you've got a knight, and the knight has killed people in battle and behaved badly off the battlefield as well. That knight will be in fear of going to hell for his sins. And what a general indulgence does is to say, well, as long as you confess to a priest what you've done, the spiritual implications of what you have done will be wiped clean. So all the things you've done, they will be cleaned from your record, spiritually speaking. Now, that's a big incentive. But as you say, once you get to particularly the late 12th, 13th century, crusading can be conducted within Christendom, and it can be conducted very much more easily, involving a much shorter journey and much shorter time commitment than going all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. People might well say, well, why go all the way to the Holy Land when a crusading indulgence can be achieved so closer to home? It's also probably worth noting that whilst we only have limited ideas of the casualty numbers on crusade, the closest thing we have to an estimate suggests that for the first crusade, for every 4 crusaders who went, only 1 came back. So the attrition rate is exceptionally high. And I strongly suspect the attrition rate would be much lower for a crusade waged in Western Christendom. So again, there might be judged to be a higher chance of surviving it, which would also be an incentive too. So yeah, there could well be a degree of that, certainly, yeah. Sorry, I've forgotten the first part of your question though.
No. I think that's fine. I think you answered both in that. It was
Okay.
basically, the fact that they didn't want to go out to the Near East, and they also had their own territorial interests, which they could do with the legitimacy of the papacy stamping it.
Yes, absolutely. And certainly some rulers try to persuade, even at times to coerce the Pope to authorize their wars against their rivals as crusades. The papacy normally tried to resist that fairly firmly, but nonetheless, that kind of thing does happen. The balancing factor, though, is that whilst the papacy was prepared to authorize crusading on other frontiers, the prospect of visiting Jerusalem in some cases, or at least various sites in the Holy Land, that was very attractive to knights and other pilgrims or crusaders from this era. And so really nothing quite competed with Jerusalem in terms of its attractiveness to people looking at that kind of venture in the medieval period.
Was it kind of interesting when you said they were granted an indulgence, a general indulgence to go out to Jerusalem, because obviously indulgences will become controversial much later on. I mean, Martin Luther's rallying against the Catholic Church was partly over indulgences and its usage. But it's also interesting because we use this term crusade, but in 1095, when Pope Urban II gave his speech in the name of what was the name of the French town he was in? It was
Clermont.
Clermont.
In France, yeah.
In France, he doesn't use the term crusade, as far as I know. He refers to it as a kind of armed pilgrimage of some kind. Could you perhaps tell us about this term and what was being used?
Sure. Yes. So one of the one of the sort of odd facts, as you say, about the Crusades is that no one called them the Crusades, at least not in their early years. So at the time of the First Crusade and soon afterwards, it was referred to as a pilgrimage or a journey to Jerusalem, something like that. It was never called a crusade. The word crusade itself comes from the Latin crusignatus, which means a person marked by the sign of the cross. And that refers, of course, to the cross that the Crusaders put on their clothing to mark the fact that they'd taken a crusading vow. But the term crusade itself is much, much later. It's only really later on that historians, more for convenience than anything else, have called these the Crusades, because a label has to be found for that kind of venture, I suppose.
It's also interesting because I think, from what I can tell, the word crusade was not used in Arabic at all until pretty much in the modern period. They start translating the word for crusade into Arabic. But before that, that wasn't the term being used.
For the most part, in the sources from the actual era, Muslim authors tend to refer to Crusaders as Franks, which is a generic term, basically meaning, or is meant to identify people from Western Christendom. Strictly speaking, it identifies people from the Kingdom of France who would self-describe as Franks. But given that people from the Kingdom of France made up a very, very large contingent in most of the crusading ventures, it's not surprising that Franks became a term for Crusaders as a whole, or indeed those who didn't go on crusade, but who perhaps travelled either on pilgrimage or to settle in the Crusader states, which were the countries or territories founded by the First Crusade in the coastal regions of the Middle East.
And was there some sort of politics involved in their word choice? Because, of course, if you're living in the environment of the Near East, it's a very religiously diverse environment. You have large Christian populations, and in fact, they may have been the majority still in many regions around Syria and so on. And so you want to be careful about conflation. Whereas if you're coming from Europe, you're coming from France, you're not so bothered about that conflation in that sense because, you don't really have a substantial Muslim population, except in places you're trying to remove them from, like Spain.
Yeah, the other term that they used, which occurs sometimes, is Latins, which is not all Crusaders spoke Latin. Often that was a language that was spoken largely by members of the church. Nonetheless, it is a language that gathers that group, as opposed to labeling people perhaps as Syriac Christians or Greek Christians, which could be grouping them by language.
Indeed, indeed,
That
indeed.
would be an alternative term. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And do we know whether there was a sort of difference in how the two sides saw those wars? So, from very early on with Pope Urban II, there's very clearly a strong religious tone to this because obviously it's a crusade. You're going out to fight a religious war. You're getting indulgences and so on. And so there's a very clear, religious element from the beginning.
Yeah.
Is that something we see mirrored on the other side, on the Muslim side, or so on? Or did they sort of evolve their views or change it over time? How did this sort of play out?
Sure. So when the First Crusade reached the Middle East at that time is in a process of transition. It's already quite a brutal transition because at the end of the 900s, so coming up to around the year 1000, you have the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate. And so where there had been a huge unitary empire spanning much of North Africa, the Middle East, all the way up to the borders of the Central Asian steppe, the Abbasid Caliphate went into decline. Many regions became quasi-independent. And then in the early 11th century, you have the advent of a series of massive invasions and migrations out of the Central Asian steppe, led by the Seljuk Turks. And they then conquered Persia, or modern-day Iran, moving into Iraq and then northern Syria, expanding into the eastern districts of the Byzantine Empire in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and also then trying to invade Egypt, which at this time was held by a Shia Muslim dynasty, the Fatimid Empire. And so the Middle East is already in a state of war. The Fatimids and the Seljuk Turks are the main combatants in that conflict. And so when the Crusades arrive, they find this is the situation as they find it. And notably, for much of the First Crusade, the Crusaders themselves are in negotiations with the Fatimids, trying to look at a way that they can form an alliance against the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk Turks themselves suffer a series of battlefield defeats at the hands of the First Crusade, which then encourages rebellions against the Seljuk Turks in their other territories. So what is created is an enormously complex political map where you have multiple factions in play. And yes, the First Crusade was raised with religious rhetoric, often very hostile rhetoric, looking at the various Muslim peoples they anticipated meeting in the Middle East. And yet very quickly, the Crusaders accommodate themselves to this new environment and realize that they had to work with local factions. And it's notable that in many of the wars that followed, there are plenty of occasions where you have Christians fighting alongside Muslims against other Muslims, or Christians and Muslims fighting against Christians and Muslims. The battle lines are not always as simple as simply Christians fighting Muslims. It creates a much more complex environment. And there are so many factions involved. There are 4 Crusader states. There's the Byzantine Empire in the north. There's the Bedouin. There's various Turkic rulers, including not just the various representatives of the Seljuk Empire, but also Turkmen nomadic groups as well, who have their own agenda. You've got the Fatimids in Egypt. You've then got various Eastern Christian communities, particularly the Armenians, who also play an important role in the politics of the area. So it becomes very convoluted very quickly. And so I suppose, I don't know, when I talk to people about the Crusades, often they expect me to sort of describe a map where you've got Christian territory on one side and Muslim territory on another side, but actually there's so many different groups involved in what becomes an incredibly complex set of relationships in the Middle East, and conflicts and diplomacy and friendships and rivalries, that it becomes very complicated very quickly.
Indeed, and as you was talking and you were mentioning these different kingdoms and different Crusader states, I couldn't help but thinking of what happened when the First Crusades arrived in Constantinople and the less than, let's say, gracious reputation they developed afterwards, because there was, I think you should tell us about this, but it wasn't a very positive meet interaction at all.
Sure. The armies of the First Crusade could be incredibly brutal. I mean, you mentioned the Byzantine Empire, but of course, the most significant massacres they conducted were in the later stages of the expedition as they advanced into Syria and then south towards Jerusalem, where they conducted a series of massacres in the Holy City itself. But to go back to the point you were making about Byzantium, it's difficult because in some respects, the Byzantines asked for assistance. So the Byzantines in 1095 at the Council of Piacenza issued only the latest in a series of requests for reinforcements against the Seljuk Turks, who are continuing to advance into Anatolia. And they didn't quite get what they were expecting. I suspect what they were looking for was perhaps 2,000 to 4,000 experienced professional soldiers who would then be hireable and could be integrated into the Byzantine army. What they got was tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of knights, as well as a very large contingent of unarmed pilgrims whose declared intention was to go to Jerusalem. And so, in a sense, they've asked for something, but that's not what's turned up. And that then creates all sorts of issues. How is this to be managed? Viewing this from the Byzantine perspective, there's already a suspicion around Western Christians and what their intentions might be. There are already tensions between the Catholic Church and the Byzantine Church, although it's too early really to be speaking of a schism, which develops much more later. But how do you manage the arrival of an army that's probably big enough to capture Constantinople if it wants to? How do you manage that if you're the Byzantine emperor? And likewise, if you are a crusade commander, how do you manage that in terms of your relationships with the Byzantine emperor? And it wasn't managed easily. There was skirmishing, there was looting, there were attacks, there was a lack of trust between the two parties involved, which certainly caused tensions in the relationship. Having said that, compromises were hammered out, and the center of that compromise was the emperor was prepared to offer logistical support for the Crusaders, and in return, the emperor wanted the crusade commanders to take an oath to the Byzantine emperor, and at the center of that oath was a promise that any lands taken by the Crusaders that were formerly Byzantine territory should be returned. And so that's how they sort of hammered out that compromise, but there was lots of skirmishing before they reached that point. It should be mentioned, though, that the Byzantine Empire did quite well from the First Crusade in the long term, because as the Crusaders advanced through Anatolia, encountering the Seljuk Turks in battle, and within that advance, the Byzantines followed a little way behind that with their own army, and they used the Crusaders' advance to sort of clear a way for them as they then conquered town after town in the Crusaders' wake. But relations fell apart much more seriously when the Crusaders took Antioch in 1098, because the Byzantines said, well, this city is a formerly Byzantine city, you should hand it back. But the Crusaders said, well, we said that they didn't feel that the Byzantines had adequately supported them, so they felt the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus hadn't offered enough support, and that their vow to him was already void, and that then created a series of disputes. The Byzantines saying you should return Antioch, and the Crusaders saying they wouldn't do it. So it's complicated.
Yes, indeed. It was a very complicated affair. But because I think on the one hand, you can read the Crusades through, there's two ways you can think about the Crusades. You can either approach it to thinking about, all of the sort of weird and funny stories you encounter, because there are a lot of stuff happening. I remember my favorite one is there was a Bavarian prince, I think, who wanted to go out on crusade towards Jerusalem. And he didn't know how to get there, but he was convinced there was a duck or a goose that was imbibed with the spirit, Holy Spirit, and would lead them towards Jerusalem. And then they got lost in the forests of Hungary or somewhere like that. So you get amusing anecdotes like that, don't you?
You do. I mean, one of the things that makes the Crusades fascinating is just how much is going on. There are things that are awful and extremely violent, but there are things that are very curious and interesting. And as you say, there are stories as well which are odd. Another one that comes to mind is there's a crusader called Geoffrey of Las Tours, and he was, I think it's during the advance on Jerusalem, he heard a cry, an animal's cry, whilst he was out on a raid or something, and he saw a lion with a snake wrapped round its body. And so he went and killed the snake, freed the lion, and the lion then became essentially his pet. And so once the crusade was over, he decided he wanted to return back to France with his pet. But not perhaps surprisingly, the Genoese sailors said, "You are not bringing a lion on the ship." And so as he had to leave without his lion. And the lion was so heartbroken, it swam out to sea following the ship, because it didn't understand why its friend wouldn't want to take him back with it. So there are lots of these sorts of peculiar stories in circulation.
Indeed, indeed. But of course, there's not to make light of the fact there were, in fact, massacres, especially, throughout, but especially during the First Crusade. I mean, I think probably most infamous would be the cannibalism at Marat. I think that's the name of the city in northern Syria. And obviously, as you mentioned, the massacre in Jerusalem as well when they captured it. So could you talk to us about these events?
Sure, yes. So as you said, there were a series of massacres. Those massacres occurred during the First Crusade, but also in the early years of the foundation of the Crusader states, particularly in the port cities conquered by those Crusaders who remained in order to establish and expand the Crusader states. There was, as you say, there was an instance of cannibalism during the siege of Mara in northern Syria. But as you also say, there's also the massacre at Jerusalem as well. And it's not just one massacre when the Crusaders crossed the walls into Jerusalem. There are several subsequent massacres in the following days. Some people managed to take refuge in the Tower of David, which is the main citadel in Jerusalem, and they then evacuated with the garrison from the citadel. Some had left the city in advance of the siege, but nonetheless, many thousands fell during that massacre. And indeed, when a Frankish chronicler called Fulcher of Chartres, he wasn't part of the siege, but he went down to visit Jerusalem a little while later. I think it was about a year later. The heaped corpses were still outside the city gates, which gives you an idea of just the intensity of the massacre. And it's thought that several thousand people were killed in that massacre. So yes, absolutely. There were massacres that took place. Explaining those massacres is complicated in some respects, because on one hand, you could say, well, the Crusaders were clearly being driven by a sense of religious zeal, and that perhaps is why they did it. On the other hand, it is complicated by the fact that during their advance on Jerusalem, the Crusaders saw no problem at all with forming alliances or discussing alliances, either with the Fatimid Empire in Egypt, or indeed with various Turkish rulers who they met en route. So we know of various Turkish commanders both in Anatolia and also one from Azaz near Aleppo, who worked or at least conducted talks with the Crusaders, and that was fine. So understanding how these bits of the jigsaw puzzle fit together, when understanding the Crusaders' mentality and what they thought they were doing, is difficult because you do have various different pieces in play.
Indeed. And one episode you did focus on, you wrote a book about, was the Battle for Aleppo.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about what was so significant about this battle and why was it such a turning point?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, when the First Crusade advanced into the Middle East, they defeated a series of major Turkish field armies. And this is the era when the Seljuk Empire, which spans from Persia all the way across to the Mediterranean coast, that's the dominant power, particularly in Syria, the Fatimids being the other empire in Egypt. But the Crusaders defeat the field armies of Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and the Anatolian Seljuks in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And those are all the big field armies. So in the wake of this, Seljuk authority looks very thin. And a series of communities who had been waiting for the chance to rebel against the Seljuks. The Seljuks themselves have only been in the area for about 20 years. They rise in rebellion. The Seljuks themselves become caught up. They've been caught up for several years, in fact, in a major civil war following the death of Malik Shah, the Seljuk Sultan, in 1092. And so the Seljuks face multiple crises simultaneously. And that creates a window of opportunity, viewed from the Frankish perspective, for them to found and then expand a series of territories that will become known to historians, at least, as the Crusader states. And so in the early years of the Crusader states, there is substantial territorial expansion. Many of the port cities fall to the Crusaders, but they also drive inland as well. And after an initial period of expansion, really the Crusaders aren't going to be able to get much further until they've conquered one or both of the following cities, and they are Damascus or Aleppo. And initially, they place a lot of emphasis on trying to conquer Aleppo. And this is a really difficult, viewing this solely from a military perspective, this is a really difficult target. Armies deployed by the Crusader states rarely got bigger than about 10,000 troops. The first crusade was much bigger, but of course they all went home, or the vast majority of them did. And yet Aleppo's population alone is about 40 to 50,000. So it's a very significant military target, and the Crusaders spent years trying to reduce Aleppo to a place where they can conquer it. Aleppo itself feels very squeezed. It's got the Crusaders on one side, which it doesn't feel particularly favorable about handing itself over to, obviously, but it doesn't feel particularly favorable in many cases about handing itself over to a Seljuk governor either. So in some ways, the Aleppan population is caught between the two. And there's even brief talks I think it's about 1117, where Aleppo considers offering itself as a protectorate to the Franks, largely because it's been so worn down by Frankish raids that it just wants them to stop, basically. So it's complex. But in 1119, the head of the Artukid dynasty, it's a Turkish dynasty from the Diyarbakir region in southern Turkey, southern Anatolia, called Ilgazi. He gathers a very large force together and decisively defeats one of the northern Crusader states called the Principality of Antioch. And that defeat derails the Frankish attempt to conquer Aleppo. And then 5 years later, when the Franks make another serious attempt to conquer Aleppo, that siege fails. And really, that's the moment that the contest for Aleppo ends. After that, you have the rise of a very, very powerful ruler called Zengi, whose major cities are Mosul and later on Aleppo. And the empire he founds is just too powerful for the Crusaders to attack. So the struggle for Aleppo is important because it is, how shall I say, the high water mark. It's the high tide mark of the Frankish conquests. They don't get any higher, they don't get any further than that. That's the moment at which it stops. That's not to say that they fall into, they begin withdrawing or fall into decline immediately after that, but they don't get any further. So it is very important from all perspectives, because this is the moment at which the Turkish rulers of the region manage to permanently stop the Franks from getting any further. Of course, it has to be said at the time they don't know that the Franks won't get any further, but in hindsight, we know that's the case.
Yes, it's very interesting. And so I suppose my question now, turning to, why did the Crusades last so long? I mean, you've mentioned, all of these difficulties with fighting the war. Of course, there are intertribal alliances, as you've mentioned. So what was the secret to their endurance?
Okay, so I mean, the Crusades themselves, of course, lasted for centuries, but to stick specifically to the Crusader states in the Middle East, they've got various factors that sort of point in their direction. One of those factors is a very, very substantial population movement from Western Christendom to the Middle East. As soon as the Crusader states are founded, it seems likely that tens of thousands of people every year moved to the Middle East in order to settle these new lands. That then gave a population base to the Crusader states, which enabled them to persist. Another thing, which, viewing this from an economic perspective, supported the Crusaders' project of the Crusader states, if you like, was the importance of the region commercially. A lot of major Italian cities that deal with trade, as well as other merchants from across the Mediterranean, they very quickly became closely involved in the big ports of the Crusader state, and they were conducting trade and commerce, and it's a really important commercial region. There's a lot of locally produced goods that can be traded. There's also intercontinental trade routes, such as the Silk Roads, which go all the way through the Middle East, China, and Central Asia, or indeed the spice routes, which go through either the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, and from there to Southeast Asia. And these goods pass through this area, or many of them do. And so that provided an economic basis for the survival of the Crusader states. And there does seem to have been a very strong sense of religious zeal behind what they were doing, which again may have given them a degree of staying power. That then, coupled with, at least in the early years, the fragmentation of the Seljuk Empire and the many problems it was facing, limited resistance. Certainly on that quarter, the Fatimids were much more determined opponents of the Crusader states in the early years. But that does go some way to explaining that. And it has to be said, there were also various communities in the region that were prepared to ally, not necessarily all the time, but sometimes with, I'll call them Franks now because we're moving beyond the Crusades in a sense. But we know of various Eastern Christian communities that allied from time to time with the Franks, also some Muslim communities too. The Bedouin, for example, at times, or some Bedouin groups worked with the Franks on some occasions as well. So they're not entirely isolated in the Middle East during that. And so all of these factors enabled them to persist for ultimately almost 2 centuries.
Indeed, indeed. And so when we're thinking about these Crusader states, you've mentioned quite a bit about giving us an idea what life might have looked like under them. But how do they sort of deal with diverse populations that they encountered if you're living in the state? How did they govern, say, when you've got Muslims inside your own state? What did they do with them?
Yes, absolutely. So initially, as we've mentioned, that the initial conquests involved several massacres. And so during the conquest phase, the Crusaders could be exceptionally brutal. After, if we move to sort of more the consolidation phase where the conquest has taken place and then what happens next, it seems it's a rather different picture. And this is a question on which historians have gone back and forth several times. And there are several points to make here. The first is that in their laws, in the laws of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, and elsewhere, Eastern Christians and Muslims are protected by the law, and yet they are also legally unequal. So they don't have the same rights as the Frankish ruling class, as it were, with Eastern Christians having more rights than Muslims, and Muslims have to pay additional taxes as well. Having said that, at the same time, there is some out migration. So some Muslim communities move out from Crusader territory to go and live elsewhere. But at the same time, there is also some in-migration, not much, but a bit as well. And there are also plenty of Muslim communities that remain under Frankish rule. And there are several reasons that might explain that, even though they are legally unequal, nonetheless. Behind the frontier, very quickly, the Crusader states become quite peaceful. So between about 1110, 1120, and then all the way through to 1180, there's a period of time for almost half a century when actually the Crusader states behind the frontier are very, very stable and at peace. They're fighting on the frontier, but away from that, things are very stable. And this is a time when the Middle East is very, very unstable, not just because of the Crusades, but because of all the various other wars that are taking place across the entire region. And so stability will look quite good to many people, even if you're in a position of legal inequality. And I think the basic ethos of the Crusader states, in terms of their treatment of Muslim populations at least, seems to have been that if Muslim populations pay their taxes, then they'll be left alone for the most part. Not in all cases, but for the most part. And that goes some way to explaining why, in fact, there were very, very few rebellions, no big ones, against the Franks at all. And another dimension to this is that there are various Muslim minority groups who do seek protection from the Franks. And so to give an example of this, you have the Nizaris, and the Nizaris are a sect of Shia Islam, and they're intensively persecuted by the Seljuk Turks. And so initially, at least, they actually seek a degree of protection from the Crusader states from that persecution. So again, it's a mixed picture. It's not simple. And in time, the Nizaris create a state for themselves in northern Syria, and that engages sometimes in positive relations with the Crusader states. Sometimes it's more hostile. That becomes quite mixed as well. But again, we come back to the issue really, which is it's complicated, and it's complicated still further by the fact that, again, commercially, the Crusader states exist in a state of symbiosis with neighboring Muslim states. So, for example, the Muslim rulers of Damascus and Aleppo, they require the ports of the Crusader states to get many of their trade goods to market in the Mediterranean. By extension, the Frankish rulers of the Crusader states rely very heavily on Damascus and Aleppo to enable the transport of goods either from those cities or traveling through those cities to their territory. So there's a strong economic reason for, at times, peace, but certainly cooperation to some degree, because they both have an interest in making the trade work. Having said that, both many Muslim authorities and the papacy ban the trade in arms across cultural boundaries. So there are limits to that trade as well. But there's a wonderful travel log by someone called Ibn Jabir, and he is a Muslim pilgrim from Al-Andalus, so Islamic Spain, essentially. And he travels on Hajj, and then on his way back from his pilgrimage, he travels back through the Crusader states. And he's quite shocked in some respects at how peaceable the relationship is between many of the Muslim communities in the northern Crusaders, or in the northern part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the Franks. But he also makes a very interesting observation, which is that he's passed through areas where fighting is taking place to the side of a road between, say, the ruler of Damascus and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And yet neither side is creating trouble for the trading caravans passing along that road. Because although they're fighting, they both have a vested interest in making sure that no one touches the trading caravans, because they both need them.
Well, that's really that's really interesting, and I think that'd make a great drama in of itself. If anyone's listening who does that, it's interesting, of course, as we've mentioned now, all of this is happening, and there is a tendency, obviously, to focus a lot on the Crusades, but we do have another group and another army coming in, which is the Mongols.
Yeah.
And if you read from an Arab perspective on history, the Mongol invasion was a very highly traumatic event, in many ways more so than the Crusades. I mean, you talk about the sacking of Baghdad in 1258, the rivers run red with ink from the libraries that were destroyed. It's regarded as one of the most traumatic events. But the Mongols soon become part of the region. They integrate and they develop new political systems and governance. So could you perhaps talk to us about, the systems the Mongols developed once they've conquered the Near East?
Yeah, sure. So the Mongol invasions into the Middle East began in 1218, when their armies attacked the town of Uttra, which is on the borders of Central Asia, following which the Mongols invaded what today would be parts of northern and eastern Iran. And then one Mongol army went south of the Caspian Sea, then up to the Caucasus, conducting a kind of reconnaissance into the Middle East. The big invasion happens in 1230, which involves the conquest of much of Persia and northern Iraq, as well as the Caucasus. That's the kingdom of Georgia and Greater Armenia. And then in 1243, the Mongols overthrow Anatolia, which is the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate, which becomes tributary to the Mongols. The next wave then happens over a decade later, where, as you say, the Mongols besiege and sack Baghdad, one of the largest cities in the world at this time, as you say, with enormous loss of life, and also the destruction of archives and buildings and all that goes with it too. So, as you say, an enormously traumatic set of invasions. Again, though, like conquerors throughout history, once the Mongols had acquired control, they were more peaceable, or at least they had an interest, at least, in maintaining at least some degree of activity in these areas, because, of course, they want to tax them. And to tax people, those people have to be allowed to continue to live and to do what they do. So, although the Mongol invasions involved enormous loss of life, the consolidation phase, again, is rather different. And yeah, the Mongols want to tax many of the remaining cities and populations in the area, and they're doing it from enormous wagon cities. So this is a site we don't see much, or we don't really see at all in the modern era, which is huge city-sized mobile encampments. And so the Mongols themselves, they ruled the Middle East much as they ruled many other areas of the world at this time. The Mongol Empire is huge. It spans from the Pacific seaboard to Southeast Asia, or parts of it, and then down to the borders of into Syria in the southwest, and the borders of Hungary and Poland in the northwest. So it's vast, and they rule many of these areas from wagon cities. So you should imagine literally tens of thousands of wagons surrounded by millions of sheep and horses and goats and other animals that form part of their nomadic lifestyle. And when the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt sent out ambassadors to some of these cities, the ambassadors reported back that it could take 2 or 3 days to cross these cities. So it's one of the sort of the major phenomena of the Mongol invasions of the Middle East, that they are ruling from these massive encampment cities. Now, Mongol rule is not gentle. Nonetheless, they want to gather tax. But one of the things that makes their rule so noticeable is that they treat the region's religious populations in a form of quasi-equality, in the sense that they're in charge and therefore everyone is subordinate to them. Now, the Mongols see all the region's religions, whether that's Islam or Christianity or Judaism or any of the other religions present, as having religious power from their own perspective. And what the Mongols are concerned to do is to make sure that that religious power is used for the expansion and prosperity of the Mongol Empire, and for the long life and success of the Mongol imperial family. And so they see religious leaders, particularly Christian and Muslim religious leaders in the Middle East, as being spiritual assets, in a sense. The religious leaders being encouraged to use their spiritual force, as the Mongols see it, for these goals. And so it is a form of equality. It's not equality and tolerance for equality and tolerance's sake, but it has that effect. But of course, what that means is, across the region, yesterday's rulers are now finding themselves in a state of being the same as yesterday's ruled, which very much upends all the former hierarchies across the entire region. But it also leads to another interesting phenomenon, which is that it raises the question of, well, how do you respond to the Mongols? What do you do? Do you rebel? And in the early years, at least, virtually no one does. And there's a reason for that, which is that by this stage, the Mongols actually are looking pretty plausible in their claim that they're going to conquer the entire world, because no one's stopping them. And their empire is bigger than any other empire in history. And so, well, why wouldn't they conquer the entire world? It's only been with the benefit of hindsight, we know that they didn't. And so as a result, rebellion looks pretty futile, really. It's just a recipe for getting killed. And so as a result, what you find is communities across the Middle East, and indeed elsewhere as well, from a whole range of different religious communities, they try a radically different approach, which is charm offensives. So if you can't defeat the Mongols, get alongside them, make yourself useful to them, offer yourself as tutors for their children, offer yourself as administrators on their territory, because maybe by doing that, you can acquire leverage. And maybe with that leverage, you can convince the Mongols to give your own community safeguards, or even better, preferential treatment, or even better, perhaps you can begin to steer those Mongol leaders towards your own culture, or even better, towards your own faith. And so this creates an incredibly dynamic environment in these Mongol courts as they fill up with representatives from different religions and cultures from across Eurasia, all trying to win favor with the Mongols, largely, it seems, because they want to advance the interests of their own particular community.
So my second to last question, so there's two more left, because as we're talking about the Mongols here, one of the things that's been suggested is that with the rise of the Mongol system, you start to see the rise of a new kind of universalism that sort of emerges, not just at the sort of political level, but just at the sort of, the way that people sort of see the whole world around them. They start thinking in more universalist terms, and that it's under the Mongols that we see this develop, even whether it's in the Near East or whether it's elsewhere in Europe. So could you perhaps talk to us about how this empire sort of facilitated that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the sort of side effects of the rise of the Mongols is travel. People travel a lot. Many travel as envoys to Mongolia or perhaps to Mongol China. The Mongols themselves move particularly skilled artisans and people with technical skills around their empire. And so if they want to exploit a mine, let's say in Kyrgyzstan or modern day Kyrgyzstan, they may, we know they did, move German miners from Hungary to mine in that area. In the same way, we know of all sorts of specialists and artisans and textile workers from the Muslim world and elsewhere, who the Mongols simply moved to where they wanted to use them. Also in the 1260s, when the great Khan, or Kublai Khan as he's often known, is conducting the final overthrow of Song dynasty China in southeast China, he actually requests and is given siege engineers from the Middle East, Muslim siege engineers, because he wants to be able to use counterweight trebuchets, which they can produce for him. So there's a lot of movement that takes place. It's not often voluntary movement. People aren't necessarily choosing to travel, but it happens anyway. And then on top of that, you have diplomats, whether from the Muslim world or from Southeast Asia or elsewhere. They're traveling around the place because they want to conduct diplomacy with the Mongols, either to negotiate peace or submission, or to try and work out what the Mongols want. And then you've got merchants. The Mongols, having conquered so many different sultanates and kingdoms and territories and communities across Eurasia, they've got money to spend, and merchants know this. And so as a result, merchants flock to the Mongol courts because that's where the money is, and merchants go where the money is. So a lot of people are traveling, and they're traveling distances that previously hadn't been possible. And as you say, that drives back the horizons of their worldview. And this is the case for many different people. So we have one Muslim commentator saying that because of interactions with the great Khans in the Mongol Empire, suddenly Central Asia is a great deal more accessible to those wishing to spread Islam into those areas and to conduct missionary activity into that area than it had been previously. In the same vein, we've got envoys from Armenia who travel to the Great Khan in Mongolia and return reporting animal species that they had never previously known before. And the Mongols themselves conduct this kind of diplomacy too, because when the Mongols advance into many areas of the world, yes, they feel they've got a right to rule the world, but they don't actually know much about that world. And so when the Mamluks send envoys to a Mongol leader in the Crimea, there's an interesting story where the Mongols say, "Oh, you're from Egypt. We've heard about Egypt. Isn't that the place where there's a big river? And the only way to cross that big river is by an enormous bone. And it's the bone so big people can cross it like a bridge. Isn't that the case with Egypt?" And the Mamluk envoys are incredibly diplomatic. And they say they haven't seen the bone, which seems to me a very sort of polite way of saying, no, there's no bone, but they don't want to offend the people they're trying to do diplomacy with. But you can see the process of mental horizons being driven back. The Mongols want to know more about the world that they're entering. They have hearsay reports of what's out there from their perspective, but those reports then get confirmed, whether by personal experience or by meeting people from that region. The Mongols even send out envoys to places as obscure and far-flung as France and the Kingdom of England, the outer edge of the known world as far as the Mongols are concerned. But there too, they return with news. It's interesting, actually. One of the things the Mongols are interested in from Western Christendom is birds of prey. It's one of the things that really joins together elites from the Muslim world, the Mongols, and Western Christendom. They all love hunting with birds of prey. And so there's actually quite a lively trade in expert falconers who get employed by various different courts. They often travel cross-culturally because everyone's interested in birds of prey and falconry. And so that's another interesting dimension to it already.
It's interesting, as you were mentioning, the Mamluks as well, because the Mamluks were one of the few armies, I think it was within Syria or perhaps a little bit further away, that was able to prevent the Mongols from entering into Egypt. They were one of the few. I'm not really sure what the reason was, but I think I was reading that in one book I read that the Mamluks were, very highly trained soldiers to the point they're almost comparable to modern special forces units, whereas the Mongols were more infantry in general. And so when it came to hand-to-hand combat, the Mamluks had the sort of advantage.
Sure, yeah. So the Mongols invaded northern Syria in 1260, and they conquered Aleppo in only a few days, and following which was an enormous massacre of the city's population. And then they advanced south. Damascus fell almost immediately, and that then gave them a frontier with the Mamluk Empire and Egypt. And the Mongols sent their standard demands via diplomats to the Mamluks, and the demands are very, very simple. You can submit to the Mongol Empire and become a client state, or the Mongols will invade. And the Mamluks sent a very, very clear message back to the Mongols in that they killed one of the Mongol envoys and shaved the beards from the other, which was a tremendous insult. So they've made it clear they're going to resist. And this is a remarkable move. The Mongol invasion army into northern Syria is thought to have been about 100,000 strong. Even on a good day, the Mamluks can only manage about 12,000 troops. So they are embarking upon a very unequal struggle. But events play out in the Mamluks' favor because the Mamluks, unlike most empires of this era, they don't wait to be attacked by the Mongols. They actually advance out from Egypt to go and meet the Mongols head on. And just before they do this, the great Khan in Mongolia, or the great Khan centered in Mongolia, actually he's in China at the time, he dies on campaign. And so the bulk of the Mongol army withdraws because they want to be involved in the election of the next great Khan, leaving only a garrison behind in Syria. And it's that garrison the Mamluks meet in battle. And the Mamluks probably couldn't have managed the full strength of the Mongol army, but they can manage a garrison. So they defeat the garrison. They then conquer or they don't conquer, but they then acquire control over Damascus and Aleppo. And it takes the Mongols 20 years before they return in force again. And in that time, the Mamluks substantially consolidate and build up their position. They do trade deals with everyone, from Southeast Asian powers through to powers in Western Christendom and elsewhere, building up their economic base. They also use their army in the intervening period to substantially reduce the Crusader states. And so when the Mongols invade again in 1280, 1281, the Mamluks are in a much stronger position. They're still weaker in terms of total numbers than the Mongols. But as you say, they're very elite forces. Mamluk forces, in their core at least, comprise of enslaved people who have been purchased. I mean, the Mamluks themselves were originally Mamluks, but Mamluks are enslaved people who have been purchased, and they're often as a child or in their adolescence, and then raised to become elite warriors. And lots of Muslim dynasties have Mamluk forces in this era, and the Mamluk Empire itself came about when the previous dynasty built up its Mamluk regiments till they were too large, and then the Mamluks then rose up against them and took power for themselves. But yes, they have these elite formations of Mamluk regiments, which add a real cutting edge to their armies. It has to be said that the Mongol armies are also very effective. The Mamluks are probably better equipped, but of course the Mongols have had decades of military success after military success, so they've got a lot of experience to draw upon too. So it's not easy for the Mamluks, but the Mamluks do manage to win the two crucial encounters in 1260 at a battle called Ain Jalut against the Mongol garrison, and then in 1281 at the Battle of Homs, Homs being just north of Damascus, which in my view actually is probably the more important of the two battles in the longer term.
So my last question then is, we've now sort of, I mean, we could talk all day about this. I'm not sure anyone wants to, and I'm sure lots of people would want to join us on that. But thinking about now what historians should look at, I mean, obviously, what work do you feel needs to be done or still to be done on the Crusades and the Mongols, in your view?
Obviously, I'll be a little bit swayed by my own sort of research interests a little bit here, but something that I'm finding really interesting is to look at the technological history of the Middle East. And there's so many technologies changing hands in these years. One question that I find very interesting is the Mongols' involvement in the spread of gunpowder. So gunpowder is originally a Chinese invention. It's not clear. It's not clear whether or to what extent the Muslim world already had gunpowder recipes, but it does seem likely that the advent of the Mongols triggered, I was going to say, an explosion of gunpowder technology across the area. And so in the wake, so by the late 13th century and into the 14th century, all the major societies of the Mediterranean and the Middle East adopt gunpowder weapons in some way, shape, or form. And I find this very interesting, either the development of new technologies or the advent of new ideas and technologies. So in this era, for example, the Mongols try to introduce paper money to the town of Tabriz. I suspect probably with a view to then rolling that out across the entire Middle East, but it doesn't work, because why on earth should you believe that a little bit of paper can replace gold or silver coinage? And why indeed? It's a perfectly reasonable objection, but it's all these sorts of technologies I find interesting. I'm also interested in the spread of technologies and how they change hands, because I suppose traditionally people tend to say, who was the most advanced civilization of this era? The Byzantines, the Muslim world, Western Christendom, and how did that change? And that kind of debate goes round and round a lot. But what I've noticed is just how much mobility there is among professionals, should we say, whether those professionals are intellectuals or falconers or mercenaries or stonemasons or carpenters, or all the kinds of people who are necessary for the various courts of this area, or indeed for the big building projects, whether those building projects are religious buildings or military buildings or palaces or anything else. Rulers aren't rich. Once they've built their palace or their city walls, they can't afford to employ everyone after that. And so we have plenty of examples of professionals like this moving to where the next job is. And if that next job is in a different culture's territory, they'll go there. And this isn't a problem. And so it seems to me that you have this incredible mobility of shipwrights and stonemasons and all the rest of it traveling where there is work. And of course, because they're traveling and because they're mixing with people from other cultures, they will naturally share their insights and their innovations as they go, which is why increasingly what I'm seeing is when innovations occur, when things begin to appear for the first time, they tend to occur almost simultaneously in different cultures. So there's been a great bit of work done by someone called Mike Fulton on the counterweight trebuchet, which is a major innovation in siege technology. He makes the point that that appears in Muslim armies and Frankish armies at more or less the same time. And I suspect that the reason for that is because both parties have access to the same siege engineers. So I'm interested in technology, but that's my own interest. On a wider canvas, there's a lot more that can be done on all sorts of other things. I'm quite interested in a recent trend in scholarship on food and the sharing of recipes and ideas around diet. And it's interesting, there's a cookbook that was owned by an Ayyubid prince. So Ayyubid means from the dynasty of Saladin, Ayyub being Saladin's father. And this cookbook has recipes from across the Middle East. It has recipes from, which should suggest a Turkish influence, a Kurdish influence, an Arabic influence, an Armenian influence, a Georgian influence. There's even a Frankish roast. So again, I find food interesting as a way of understanding how cultures interacted. There's also a lot of work that needs to be done on Arabic sources. Many of the major political histories of this era have been translated from people writing at this particular time, but there's lots of other sources that still need to be edited or need further studies or analysis. The one that comes immediately to mind are many of the really big biographical dictionaries, which are from this era, which are absolutely fascinating. And I think there's probably a lot more work and findings that can be done on those. So there's always a lot to do.
Nicholas Morton, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you've missed this one or would like to catch up with previous ones, please do go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.